want you to imagine yourselves back in 2022 for a moment. No, don't worry, I'm not going to make you relive any painful breakup or that terrible hangover or anything like that. I want you to remember the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how by the end of that year, Vladimir Putin's Russia came to be in a very complicated situation. From claiming to have taken control of Ukraine in 48 hours, it went on, at the end of 2022, to be forced to retreat after suffering losses that would have been unimaginable just a few months earlier. You remember, the Ukrainian army's advances were impressive. News like this seemed to confirm David's victory against Goliath.
Ukrainians celebrate soldiers retaking Kherson, Russia's latest defeat.
What's more, the delivery of Leopards and other heavy equipment was already being promised at that time, so everything seemed to be going full steam ahead. Nevertheless, 2023 came, and Moscow learned how to resist. The Ukrainian counteroffensive was a colossal failure. The delivery of Western equipment never met expectations, and in the end, Putin managed to retain his conquests. Even so, the story could have been very different for the lord and master of Mother Russia. Because what if I told you that it wasn't the Russian military that saved Putin from the hecatomb in Ukraine during the first year of the war, a disaster that could have cost the Russians many more losses and casualties than they already, in and of themselves, had? What if I told you that Putin avoided the worst-case scenario by a decision he made back in 2016. Indeed, the fact that the Russian campaign in Ukraine did not end up collapsing after the surprising resistance and pressure from the Ukrainian army was due to an initiative that the Russian president took 6 years before the war started all over Ukraine. We're talking about the implementation of his own Praetorian Guard, the Russian National Guard, one of the great forgotten protagonists in this conflict. And okay, the question is, what precisely is this Russian National Guard stuff? Well, let's see. Many analysts will tell you that it's basically a paramilitary group whose creation was prompted by Putin himself with two objectives in mind: to defend the national territory and to control order within the country, or rather to protect the regime against anything that might happen. The fact is that these two objectives are basically the tasks given by law to this new paramilitary corps. The reality, as I say, is that the so-called Rosgvardia was designed to be the lifeline, the survival insurance of the Russian regime. In fact, this body was created precisely because of Putin's fears of news like this.
Interest in a palace coup against Putin said growing among Russian elites.
Indeed, for a time, coinciding with the collapse of oil prices, Putin feared that Russia would have its own color revolution. You know, movements like the Rose Revolution in Georgia, or the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, where both the population and a good proportion of the military put an end to the pro-Moscow bigwigs, and that was precisely what was behind the creation of the National Guard. Now, this raises several questions, starting with this one. If the military were to rebel against Putin, what would prevent the National Guard from joining the coup? Well, here we come to a crucial point. You see, over the years, Putin has developed a system of intelligence, security, and loyalties that allow him to know down to the smallest detail what is going on in the country's circles of power. But in the case of the National Guard, this control is multiplied by 10, and there's even more. This body does not answer to any ministry. This National Guard answers only to Vladimir Putin himself. So it's not only a question of loyalty, but also of direct control. What's more, Putin placed Viktor Zolotov, who had previously been the head of the Presidential Security Service, Russia's own secret service, and who is one of the president's most trusted men at the head of this body. And certainly don't imagine that we're talking about a small corps, not at all. The National Guard is a huge paramilitary force of some 200,000 troops with artillery, airplanes, combat helicopters, drones, yes, and even tanks. In fact, this body has been growing in size and capabilities practically uninterruptedly, but especially since one historical event that we're going to look at in this video, and that marked a real turning point for its performance, but more on that later. The point is that this corps, which is getting stronger and stronger, is on the way to becoming, in practice, a kind of parallel army in the personal service of Vladimir Putin. In a way, we could say that it increasingly resembles Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Because remember that the Persian country has two armies, the conventional armed forces on the one hand, and the Revolutionary Guard in the service of the Ayatollahs on the other. Be that as it may, the point is that this force can be said to have saved Putin's campaign in Ukraine. How did they do it? How does Putin use this particular Praetorian Guard? Well, that's what we're going to look at right now.
The Rosgvardia, key in Ukraine.
There is a popular expression that says, stick to your lane. And do you know what? That's what many National Guard troops probably thought when they were sent to Ukraine. You see, the reality is that the troops of Vladimir Putin's favorite paramilitary group didn't have much luck during the first months of the invasion. In theory, according to the plans, this corps was assigned a very important role during the first hours of the occupation, nothing less than to take control of the main centers of power. In fact, both their military units and their rapid reaction corps advanced with more agility than the army's own units. The problem was that, since the invasion plan did not work out as the Kremlin had hoped, they suffered major blows. For example, on 25th February 2022, several police units of the Rosgvardia tried to enter Kyiv with light transport vehicles. It was them who we saw on the very outskirts of the Ukrainian capital. The result? An ambush, and the entire column of vehicles with troops destroyed on the Irpin River Bridge. The National Guard's entry into Ukraine was a disaster. Demotivation spread throughout the corps. Keep in mind that this was their first major intervention, and things did not go well at all. In fact, faced with heavy casualties and the lack of heavy weapons, many Guard soldiers did not hesitate. They turned back. This was the case for hundreds of fighters of the 121st Operational Purpose Regiment of the National Guard, who decided to withdraw from Kharkov on their own, which later earned them a withering dismissal. But hold on a minute, didn't we say at the beginning of this video that the National Guard has been key in Ukraine? Didn't we agree that without the Guard, Putin's entire operation would have been in danger of going down the drain? Yes, indeed, we aren't changing the story. The point is that the Guard has not been crucial for taking up positions, nor has it been crucial for fighting on the battlefront, but it has been crucial for Putin for three other reasons. First, to make it easier for the Russian military to focus strictly on combat. How do they do that? Quite simply, while the Federation armed forces fight and devote their energies to the front, they don't have to worry about keeping the conquered territories under control, with all that this entails. These days, the National Guard is in charge of that. The Emperor's Praetorian Guard, that is, Vladimir Putin's, has become responsible for keeping the territories occupied by Russia during the invasion under control. We're talking specifically about the regions of Luhansk, which the Russians completely control, as well as Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Kherson, of which he controls 60 to 70%. And what's more, do you remember how Russia annexed these territories? Apart from taking them by force in an attempt to legitimize their presence in these regions, totally fraudulent annexation referendums were held. Well, do you know who were some of the main players in these referendums? Exactly, the paramilitaries of the National Guard. The fact is that the members of this corps have been in charge of establishing order in the streets of the annexed territories. Well, when we say establishing order, you know what we mean, don't you? Exactly, to silence all dissenting voices and persecute troublesome Ukrainians who refuse to be part of Putin's circus. In other words, we're talking about the fact that this formation has one key mission: to consolidate political control of the invaded Ukraine. They have to mold these territories in the image and likeness of the great leader's dreams. And so the National Guard went after alleged extremists and rioters. From the day of the invasion until the last day of December 2023, at least 687 arbitrary detentions of civilians were counted, although the figure is probably much, much higher. We're talking about local journalists, mayors, activists, all of them were imprisoned on Russian territory and subjected to torture. In fact, do you remember the Ukrainian raid on Kursk? Well, this is one of the news items that stayed with us.
Ukrainian forces stormed penal colony in Kursk Oblast, where Ukrainian prisoners were held, human rights activists say.
However, this is just one of many examples of something much bigger that the National Guard has been undertaking in Ukraine. Because another of their activities has been the mass deportation of Ukrainians to Russia. Let's see, do you remember why Putin has an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court? He has it precisely for illegally and massively transporting Ukrainian children to Russian territory. Today, we know that some 20,000 minors were abducted by the Russian authorities, by the National Guard. However, some estimates claim that the number could be much higher. Some speak of hundreds of thousands, and this could be added to hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians of legal age who have also been forced to move away from their land. But wait a minute, because the National Guard has not only been responsible for persecuting and deporting Ukrainians, the reality is that this paramilitary group has also played an important role. It protects and maintains control of crucial infrastructure. The Rosgvardia has been instrumental in protecting the Russian army's logistical lines. The Crimean Bridge is a clear example. Although, well, maybe not such a good one. After all, a few Ukrainian explosives slipped through and did almost wreck the bridge. In other words, however, the success has been resounding. For example, in protecting one of the two most important nuclear power plants that the Russians took over, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. In fact, At the end of 2023, the Ukrainians tried to seize it up to 3 times, but the National Guard, along with the army, managed to retain control of this plant. But that's still not all. On top of everything we've already discussed, repression, deportations, and protection of critical infrastructure, this corps has had another important mission in Ukraine: to limit the collaboration of Ukrainians from the occupied territories with the Ukrainian army itself. And obviously, when you invade a country, one of the biggest problems you face is that the population of these places can collaborate with the national military, in this case, the Ukrainian military. We're talking, for example, about conveying information and possible targets. Well, perhaps the most important mission of this corps has been precisely to limit this communication, something which gave a great advantage to the Ukrainian army during the first months of the war. How do they do it? Well, with counterintelligence functions controlling communications, putting fear in the local people's minds, stopping what we could call the resistance, and things like that. The point is, the Russian National Guard has been able to accomplish all these missions reasonably well, and for that reason, it has been a key element in Putin's campaign in Ukraine. Not because of its combat capability, but because of its skill in suppressing dissidents and basically controlling the annexed regions with an iron fist. For most analysts, this has been a crucial element for Russian efforts. Just think, if the army had been tasked with National Guard duties, it may not have been able to keep up on the front lines because it would have consumed too many troops and too much energy on these missions. Kind of like what happened to the US Army when it had to take over control of the streets of Iraq, which was a disaster. But no, in this case, Putin's Praetorian Guard has served the Emperor well. Perhaps not as was imagined at the beginning of the invasion, but in the end, it has been crucial to the Russian war effort, and that's why Putin has been rewarding them by giving them more and more resources. So in this light, the idea of creating this corps in 2016 was a good idea for the Kremlin's interests. Of course, the National Guard has not only earned its paycheck in Ukraine. The second reason why this force has been so indispensable to Putin has to do with its work at home, watching the backs of the Kremlin's top brass. For example, it's estimated that more than 15,000 anti-Putin opponents and protesters have been detained by this body since the invasion began. Since the beginning of the war, the Rosgvardia has been in charge of ensuring that any spark of popular discontent is quelled before it becomes a fire. And this is something they have also done well. Now, the third reason why they've earned the salary, and really their main task, the main responsibility of this body, is something much more important for this sort of 21st century czar that is Vladimir Putin. Listen up.
Putin's personal shield. Russian National Guard eyes tanks after Wagner mutiny.
VisualPolitik community, you don't have to look back too far to remember when the Wagner Group, led by the controversial Yevgeny Prigozhin, started its march to Moscow. Do you remember? I'm sure you do. What did the Kremlin do at that time? Well, at that tense moment, Putin activated his National Guard to protect the heart of Russian power. And so, as Wagner's columns approached advancing at full speed, the Rosgvardia set up checkpoints and blockades to armor Moscow. These agents also tried to stop the Wagner advance in several localities, for instance, by blocking the main roads or setting up ambushes. And of course, they also took care to ensure that other military units did not join the insurrection. All in all, the Prigozhin uprising made one thing clear: Putin's Praetorian Guard was not well equipped. It had nothing with which to take on the armored vehicles and mobile artillery systems that the Wagners had, or that, if necessary, mutinous soldiers might have. Let's just say that in this case, Putin was lucky. No other military units joined the Wagners, and Prigozhin eventually slowed his march after Lukashenko's mediation. But of course, these things cannot be left to the goddess of fortune. The inability of the National Guard to thwart the Wagners was a wake-up call for Putin. If the force charged with his protection could not deal with such a threat, how could it guarantee the Kremlin's stability in the future? Well, VisualPolitik community, the response was drastic. Check it out.
Russia's 200,000-strong National Guard is getting armed with heavy weaponry, and a sign of its growing importance to Putin, UK intel says.
We're talking about heavy weapons, helicopters, and even tanks. The person in charge of ensuring that Wagner's humiliation is not repeated is the head of the National Guard, Viktor Zolotov. For him, it's strictly necessary that the National Guard not only be able to protect Moscow, but to act as a full military force when required. This change marks a real turning point in its structure, from being basically an internal control force to becoming a hybrid force capable of playing an active military role. A sort of second army. Do you remember what we said before about the Revolutionary Guard? Or we could look for another good example. The SS, which evolved from being a paramilitary force to guarantee the security of the Nazi Party, to having its own military arm, the Waffen-SS, which at its peak had about 38 combat divisions with about 600,000 troops. Even so, don't think that this is an easy task. In a country like Russia where resources are limited and military hierarchies are deeply rooted, any change generates tensions. And the case of Rosgvardia is no exception. Equipping it with tanks and heavy weaponry ignited an internal conflict over the allocation of resources at the time, when the Russian military-industrial complex was already stretched to the limit by the war in Ukraine. Because it stands to reason that reinforcing the National Guard means that other corps receive fewer supplies and equipment. What's more, Rosgvardia is gaining more and more influence, and almost no one in the traditional Russian apparatus likes that either. Because, as I said, this guard just keeps increasing its powers, even leaving the Ministry of the Interior in the background. The reason? For Putin, Rosgvardia is not just a security force. We're talking about a real personal life insurance. And the fact is that while the Ministry of the Interior and the military have their own dynamics, their own bureaucracy, and are more related to the state than to Putin himself, the case of the National Guard is completely different. This body was born purged of possible traitors. Its commanders are people of strict confidence of the great leader. Here, money rules more than tradition. A meticulous control has been established so that foreign intelligence services cannot get their hands on it. It has less bureaucracy, and its whole design has been prepared to protect the great leader. And that's why Putin relies much more on this body than on any other, which is causing a blatant transfer of powers in his favor. So they are getting bigger, more powerful, and more influential, because they don't have to respect the bureaucracy of traditional chains of command. They have much more flexibility to hire mercenaries, for example. Remember the Wagners? Well, many of them are here now.
How Russia is recruiting Wagner fighters to continue war in Ukraine. After the mysterious death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin is urging mercenaries to sign contracts and swear allegiance to Russia.
The truth, the feeling is that Vladimir Putin has been left with a trauma. The strengthening of the National Guard cannot be understood without mentioning Putin's fear of an internal military mutiny. Following the Wagner uprising, it became clear that even the most loyal pillars of the regime could falter under pressure if they aren't properly tied down. And Putin knows that. In a system based on force and control, any crack in the chain of command could become a dangerous crack. So since then, the priority has been to ensure that the National Guard is the last line of defense in the event of a military uprising. This way, if a new threat ever arises, Putin will have a loyal force capable of quelling any insubordination before it can reach Moscow. This is particularly important at a time when the situation in Ukraine, the heavy casualties being suffered by the Russian army, and growing domestic unrest are straining the situation. Because apart from the arrival of Trump to power, or the Russian advances on the front, don't forget that this is where things stand.
Russia casualties reached 600,000 during war in Ukraine, Pentagon says.
And this is always a source of potential risk for the guy at the helm. But now Putin has his exclusive Praetorian Guard, his own SS, his own Revolutionary Guard. And thanks to them, to the role they have played in Ukraine, and above all, to their role within Russia, this new Tsar sleeps much more peacefully. But, VisualPolitik community, now I leave the question to you. Did you know about this personal bet of Putin's? Will the Russian National Guard become a full-fledged armed force? Don't forget to like this video if you found it interesting, and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so already. These are small gestures that help the channel a lot. As always, thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.